Hello, everyone. It's James. Sorry about the creaking in the chair. I'm back after a very long, extended absence. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2024. I hope everyone's years have gotten off to a good start. And I'm thinking about getting back into this whole YouTube ASMR thing. And also thinking about maybe doing some other stuff outside of just history related ASMR. 2023 was a pretty tough year for me. And I'm thinking about just kind of doing rambles about talking about different things that happen in my life and some of my own experiences and some of my own struggles, just as a sort of outlet for myself. So this remains just as a sort of outlet for myself, sort of like I'm talking to a therapist. But I've also enjoyed listening to ASMR videos and other people's ASMR videos in which they do something similar, where they just kind of ramble about everyday life problems, things that they've been through, because it's sometimes nice to hear about other people's experiences and that you're not alone in feeling certain ways. And it's also so it's beneficial for you guys, hopefully, and that it's relaxing you and making you feel better about yourselves, and maybe getting some advice here and there that you should definitely take with a grain of salt, because I'm not a professional. Um, but also beneficial for me in that it allows me to get things off my chest. So I'll go ahead and start making videos like that if I get even one comment on this video asking for it. So leave a comment down below if that's something you'd think you'd like to see from me, because a lot happened in 2023 in my personal life. So, and in doing so, I won't be using anybody's names, because people I know do follow this channel irregularly. So I do not want to overshare or have people's identities exposed out of respect for them. And I'll be careful with what I talk about, of course. So today, I just wanted to start off the year with something easy. This is an essay I wrote last term in university. As a reminder, I'm in the third year of my undergrad at Carleton University, and this is an essay I wrote for a class on the French Revolution, specifically the 1789 to 1799 French Revolution, because there were many. And I believe the essay topic was something to do with, it was asking whether this revolution was a Marxist revolution or not, or whether it was whether it was a class revolution. And that was sort of the prompt that we were given. And it's about a 3,000 word paper, and I just thought I'd read it for you today, alternating between soft spoken and whispering for your relaxation and education and whatever else. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. The 1789 to 1799 French Revolution is one of the most studied historical topics, and is consequently rife with evolving historiographical debate and interpretation. For much of the 20th century, historians' consensus was that it was a bourgeois revolution, according to the Marxist school of thought that believed in a dialectical pattern of history, in which oppressed groups continuously overcome and replace their oppressors until reaching an eventual classless communist society. This consensus saw the revolution as a middle-class-led revolution, in which these capitalist bourgeoisie replaced the feudal nobility and monarchy as the oppressors of society, with the poor, working class, and peasants under their thumb. In the 1970s, revisionist historians began to challenge this consensus en masse, urging that other factors like political and cultural change were just as important as class considerations. Some revisionists even argued that historians should not consider the revolution a class revolution at all. This take has been largely discredited, with more recent scholarship exploring the strengthening of a middle-class bourgeois identity as a consequence of the revolution, more so than it being something that existed prior. This paper seeks to build off this most recent scholarship by asserting that the 1789 French Revolution was a class revolution, but not one that fits neatly into the Marxist view of it as a transition to a capitalist bourgeois society. The revolution helped create new notions of class identity and consciousness for a developing middle class as the rightful rulers of society, and for the poorer members of the Third Estate as unfairly excluded political agents. However, the failure of capitalism and the bourgeoisie to maintain exclusive control of the revolution prevents this paper from agreeing with the Marxist interpretation that the bourgeoisie replaced the nobility as France's dominant class. First, it is necessary to define who encompasses this emerging bourgeoisie. Marxists use the term to describe those who own the means of production and most of society's wealth. However, in revolutionary France, that group also encompasses much of the feudal nobility. It is not a productive framework to consider the bourgeoisie indistinguishable from the nobility. Debates about who belongs to the bourgeoisie description in the revolution are as old as the debate about its class-driven nature. 20th century historian and subscriber to the Marxist interpretation, Albert Sobel, considered artisans the majority of the sans-culottes who fought for the more radical revolutionary measures better suited to the lower classes. To be bourgeoisie. More recently, historian Bertel Nicard has pointed out that it is still unclear how peasant and sans-culotte actions in the revolution, long thought now to be autonomous from urban middle-class revolutionary behavior, fit into a characterization of the revolution as bourgeois. This paper seeks to answer that question by framing the sans-culotte and peasants as one developing class entity, and the property middle class with enough land to participate in revolutionary government as another. It is the latter that this paper defines as bourgeoisie, though this term may not be the best word to describe it. Indeed, confusion derives from the fact that economic class was not the primary demarcation of society before the revolution. Noble status was. Though capitalist revenue would help middle-class people buy their way into the nobility or become better off than lower-class nobles throughout the 18th century, blurring the lines of social power and thereby fueling revolutionary fervor. It would take the revolution itself to begin to concretize a society newly divided by economic inequality rather than status privileges. In some ways, this paper agrees with the historian George Taylor, who argued that one should view the revolution as a political revolution with social consequences rather than the reverse. It was undoubtedly a revolution revolving around class interests, specifically in how it changed people's view of themselves and gave them a greater sense of class identity. However, the catalyst for the revolution itself heavily involved political considerations, like the First and Second Estates' attempts to prevent the Third Estate delegates from having an equitable voice in the Estates General, or developing notions of rights and liberty borrowed from the French Enlightenment and the American Revolution. The political events that led to the revolution, in conjunction with economic causes like the growing wealth of the bourgeoisie, led to the social changes that allow one to consider it a class revolution. Indeed, the revolution strengthened the bourgeoisie's conception of its identity meaningfully for the first time. This identity viewed itself as more politically deserving than the lower classes of the Third Estate. As historian Henry Heller notes, in the early years of the revolution, the idea of the bourgeoisie as a class was not common and the term's meaning was still up in the air. Nevertheless, there were articulations of this burgeoning identity as early as 1789. For instance, middle-class men who met the property requirements to vote for delegates in the Third Estate met at the Hôtel de Ville on the night of July 12th to 13th. There, they organized something they explicitly called the Milice Bourgeoisie, or bourgeois militia, to combat and control the rioting lower classes in Paris. This same group would lead the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, while simultaneously disarming and keeping arms away from lower classes they believed, as historian Mika Alpal puts it, incapable of good order. Members of this same class distinction would go on to form the National Guard, the revolutionary government's defense force. Therefore, the leading forces of the revolution had already established themselves as a bourgeoisie separate from and opposed to the lower classes of the Third Estate, whom they forcefully excluded from participating in revolutionary activity in the revolution's first months. While nobles and clergy may also have been members of the National Assembly, it was the bourgeoisie who held the manpower in the form of the National Guard, in essence a bourgeois militia by a more legitimate sounding name. Awareness of themselves as a class would only continue to grow once the bourgeoisie had established themselves as the primary arbiters of political power. In Heller's work, he mobilizes a letter written by the former mayor of Paris, Jérôme Pétion, in 1791, which grows to national attention and thus effectively represents one of the most prominent conceptualizations of social classes at the time. In it, Pétion argued that the bourgeoisie were splitting themselves up too much from the rest of the Third Estate, and attempting to place themselves above them, which Pétion believed the nobility would take advantage of to reassume power. This example is yet another contemporary acknowledgement of a developing bourgeois identity that did not concretely exist before the revolution. More than that, it is recognition that whereas previously the revolution had been more about gaining political rights for the Third Estate, kept from them by the monarchy and nobility, it had begun to devolve into a class revolution marked by divisions of wealth within that Third Estate. The clearest example of this is how the National Assembly in the early years of the revolution divided people into what they called active and passive citizens. Passive citizens being those they denied voting rights or participation in government based on a lack of adequate property ownership. Moreover, the National Guard continued to quell discontent among these passive citizens, the urban lower classes and peasantry, even though the National Assembly's recently published Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was supposed to guarantee freedom from oppression. Ultimately, the bourgeoisie had developed enough of a class-defined superiority complex by 1791 that class considerations took precedence over stated goals of political rights. Newly Christian passive citizens developed their own class identity in response to increasing bourgeois opposition. Even Saul, who considered the sans-culotte bourgeoisie, conceded that the peasantry and sans-culotte had their own revolutionary goals separate from the bourgeoisie. For instance, sans-culotte, unlike the bourgeoisie, were consistently concerned with food prices and availability, even demanding fixed prices for staple items like bread. They also favored limits to the amount of land individuals could possess, in conflict with the bourgeoisie's property requirements that excluded them from political participation. Articulating issues uniquely affecting their social strata and advocating reform beneficial to that strata demonstrates a developing class consciousness. The lower classes may not have been able to participate in the revolutionary government, but they could make political points through protest and unrest. For example, a worker named Eugène Gervais was arrested in 1789 for rallying workers in the Palais Royal against the National Guard. Meanwhile, peasants went on rural strikes against capitalist farms in northern and eastern regions near Paris. According to Heller, these events pair well with numerous scholarship that explores significant worker unrest as wages decreased while profits and rents increased, a well-known pattern of bourgeois exploitation of workers in a capitalist system. Significantly, the arrested man Gervais spoke of those who he rallied against, the National Guard, as the bourgeoisie. Therefore, in addition to formulating their own identity through collective action against their economic oppressors, there is evidence that some recognize these oppressors as a new, distinct class too. Further reflecting this identification of an enemy class are the writings of Jean-Paul Marat, a radical journalist during the Revolution whose ideas reached large audiences as they were read aloud in the street. Marat wrote in 1791 that, quote, "We won't allow ourselves to be lulled to sleep by the bourgeoisie as we have been until now." End quote. As a famous journalist, Marat's ideas of the bourgeoisie as an oppressive class repressing the rest of society would have likely permeated the urban lower classes and influenced the thinking of workers like Eugène Gervais. Peasants in the countryside were less exposed to these ideas and less educated. There is nevertheless evidence that they opposed the newly developing capitalist bourgeoisie in their own right, even if they may not have been able to conceptualize it in class terms. Agrarian revolts and petitions against large farms illustrate this fact. Many peasants opposed the revolution's attempts to transform agriculture into a capitalist venture. Peasants knew that the newly developing rural bourgeoisie was swallowing up vast swaths of land in the wake of the revolution. According to historian Peter McPhee, nearly half of the land left vacant by émigré nobles who fled France during the revolution was bought by the rural bourgeoisie who already had much property, only increasing their holdings further. While there may be less evidence that peasants began to conceptualize themselves as a class in the same way urban lower classes did, bourgeois exploitation, especially through disproportionate land ownership, was a visible phenomenon that began to affect them negatively, and they resisted where they could. The development of a new class of oppressors, replacing the feudal lords of the old regime, was too conspicuous for peasants to ignore. While the early revolution may have served the interests of a developing bourgeoisie and increased the class consciousness of both of them and a nascent proletariat, the beginning of the second phase of the revolution in 1792, during which the lower classes gained more bargaining power, prevents this paper from considering the revolution a bourgeois revolution, according to the early 20th century Marxist interpretation. When the more radical Jacobins assumed control of the revolutionary government amidst popular pressure and set about creating a new constitution, they conceded to myriad demands from the urban lower classes and peasantry, including setting maximum food prices and redistributing land to previously landless peasants to give them better means to resist the growing land base of the rural bourgeoisie. These measures ran contrary to capitalism and the interests of the burgeoning bourgeois class. Though these factors may contradict the 20th century Marxist interpretation of the revolution, it is essential to remember that this interpretation was primarily developed by liberal historians. According to historian Bertrand Lagarde, Marx did not consider the French Revolution a bourgeois revolution. Instead, the most influential group in the revolution, according to Marx, was the unnumbered masses, the peasants and the urban lower class. Instead, Marx believed the revolution set the stage for transitioning to a society dominated by bourgeois capitalist rule. This paper agrees with this apparently neglected interpretation from Marx himself. The revolution prepared French society for an eventual capitalist bourgeois system by increasing the class consciousness and power of the bourgeoisie and revealing to lower classes and peasants that these bourgeoisie were their class enemies and would seek to repress them whenever expedient. However, the transition did not successfully occur immediately, nor was it free from periods of regression. Namely, the terror in 1793 and 1794 threw a spanner in the revolution so that it ceased to be one that served any class. The egalitarian language of the revolution was taken to its logical conclusion, and everyone, regardless of wealth or social rank, became citizens viewed equally under the law. In this case, the state viewing all citizens equally under the law meant that anyone could be sentenced to the guillotine on trumped-up charges at any given moment. Some, like Henry Heller, argued that the terror was a response to the dangerous increasing class polarity posed to the survival of the revolution. In this way, rather than an accidental aberration that disrupted the transition to bourgeois capitalism, according to liberal Marxist thought, the terror was a product of a confused mixing of top-down, the Jacobins, and bottom-up, the peasants and sans-culottes, pressures that sought to resist bourgeois hegemony. Ultimately, The terror and radical phase of the revolution more broadly revealed the complex nature of the revolution and how these newly developing classes, while making progress, had yet to be fully entrenched. In the terror, radical bourgeoisie, fighting for the interests of vocal lower classes and peasants, led to the brief disintegration of class distinction in the eyes of the law altogether. Classes in this time could blend together, disappear, reappear, and redefine themselves more than once all in a decade. Moreover, the more moderate bourgeoisie re-established control over the revolution from 1794 to 1799 and once again clamped down on the urban lower classes and rural peasants. Napoleon's assumption of power at the end of the century ushered in decades of French authoritarianism with only limited bourgeois elements. Finally, it is imperative to refute the popular 21st century argument among historians that a bourgeoisie did not exist in revolutionary France. A foremost example of these historians is Sarah Matza, who argues that classes only exist if they recognize their own existence, something she believed was not the case for the bourgeoisie in revolutionary France. This paper has sufficiently proven, through empirical evidence, that the bourgeoisie began conceptualizing themselves as such, even using that exact terminology. In the beginning and later stages of the revolution, the bourgeois conceived of themselves as separate from the nobility and above the lower classes and peasantry, barring any who did not meet specific property requirements from actively engaging in the revolutionary political system. Therefore, they met the constructive standards Matza and others claim they did not. The 1789 to 1799 French Revolution was a class revolution that strengthened class consciousness among the bourgeoisie and the lower classes, setting the stage for the later emergence of a bourgeois capitalist status quo. However, interruptions like the Terror, Napoleon's regime, and the subsequent restoration of the monarchy means one should not view the revolution through a 20th century Marxist framework that saw capitalism and the bourgeoisie as the immediate new arbiters of economic and political power after its conclusion. Instead, future scholarship should study it as a class revolution while considering all its complexity and not try to sort what those classes mean into neat little boxes, because contemporaries were still trying to figure that out too. A 20th century Marxist interpretation is too restrictive. Nor should future scholarship follow revisionists and more recent historians' attempt to deny the existence of a conscious bourgeoisie during the revolution, for the evidence provided in this essay verifies its albeit embryonic existence. Future historiography should pay more attention to how the revolution lays the groundwork for the transition to bourgeois capitalism, rather than being the beginning of this transition in and of itself. So, that was the essay, and remember to comment down below what you'd like to see from this channel, and whether you'd like some more ramble videos about my personal life that I've seen some other ASM artists do. And thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.